Okay, it is now 1:35. Good afternoon. Good morning to our West Coast friends and good evening to those who are connecting from Europe. Welcome wherever you are coming from. We have quite an international audience today, and I would like to thank you all for joining us to this unique interdisciplinary event. My name is Sara Agnelli, and I am the Teaching Program Coordinator and Interdisciplinary Academic Advisor at the One Center of Excellence, University of Florida. And before we start, some housekeeping. We will leave a question and answer at the end of the talk. Both virtual and in-person audience are encouraged to address questions and comments. If you are connecting via Zoom, feel free to use the chat. And if you are attending this event in person, please remember to press the button at the mic nearby so people online can hear you as well. So this event would have not been possible without the Center of European Studies at the University of Florida and the support of the Department of Linguistics and Brain, Language, and Acoustic Behavior. Special thanks go to our video production specialist, Rob Bailey, as well as Barbara Larson, Assistant Director, Education Training Programs, and Director at the Center of Online Learning and Technology. Last but not least, I would like to thank the Director of the One Health Center, Dr. Ilaria Capua, whose interdisciplinary vision has been critical to foster research and teaching collaboration between experts from different fields who are interested in investigating the complexity of health from any perspective. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Eleonora Rossi. Professor Rossi joined the Department of Linguistics at UF in the spring of 2019. And she's one of the directors of the Blab Lab. Her research focuses on language processing and bilingualism. The overarching goal of her work is to understand the neurocognitive basis of bilingualism and the early stages of second language acquisition. She uses tools like EEG, eye tracking, and MRI to learn about the cognitive and neural effects of second language acquisition and how these processes change as people age. In 2001, after completing a master's degree in speech therapy and pathology, she shifted her studies to neuroscience and bilingualism. She got her master and PhD from the University of Groningen, Netherlands. She was postdoctoral research associate and visiting assistant professor at the Center for Language Science and Department of Psychology, Penn State University. Before coming to UF, Professor Rossi became assistant professor of the Department of Psychology and Sociology at California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, California. Eleonora is a dear friend, colleague, and collaborator of the One Health Center for some years now. And it was almost 2 years ago when we had an event here in G001 about embracing the value of language diversity through the cognitive neuroscience of bilingualism with Professor Gigi Luke. And it is incredible that today, 2 years after, with all we have been going through, we are here to present another phenomenal speaker together. Professor Rossi, Eleonora, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sara, so much for the wonderful introduction. I'm here actually to just introduce our speaker for today. But today, I would just like to mention a couple of things about why this topic is important. We know that life experience changes us. You should all be able to see the slides, right? Yeah. So life experiences changes us, and we know these experiences can be really varied, and they really interact with our minds and brains. We also know that the research on language and bilingualism has been deemed as one of the 125 questions, most important questions for the future of science to discover. And if you can just see at this chart of articles published in the science of bilingualism since the early days, you can see that the number is quite skyrocketing. And we also know that science had a great impact issue just last year talking about the bilingual language brain. So we know that Knowing and speaking two languages has a massive impact on our brains and minds, including starting from early childhood. We know that those consequences continue in life. So what you see here is just an image of a slice of a brain that is colorful, which means that there are a lot of things going on in a bilingual brain that might differ from those brains of people who speak only one language. And we also know that bilingualism might be fundamental and foundational for changing the way we can interact in older adulthood. So all in all, bilingualism seems to be an asset for our lifespan from infancy to older adulthood. We know that it has an impact on our brains and minds, on schooling and education, for our social networks. And really, the research on bilingualism can have an impact on science, policymaking, and health in general. So this is really the main message I have for you. And in fact, one of the leading experts in the field is our speaker for today, Dr. Jason Rothman. And I have now the great pleasure to introduce Jason. Dr. Rothman is professor of linguistics at the Arctic University in Tromsø, Norway, where he is the deputy director of the Aqua Aurora Center and the director of the Psycholinguistics of Language Representation Polar Lab. Dr. Rothman held previous appointments as professor of psycholinguistics and multilingualism at the University of Reading, UK, and a position as associate professor of Hispanic linguistics here at UF. Dr. Rothman got his MA and PhD at the University of California, Los Angeles, and holds a BA in Spanish from Cornell University. Dr. Rothman's research is foundational to the field of linguistics and bi and multilingualism. More specifically, his work has focused on unpacking what is behind the variability in learning trajectories and outcomes that is often found in heritage language acquisition, processing, and use. His research has spanned from theoretical approaches to heritage speaker in bilingualism to more applied by bridging psycho and neuroimaging methods to understand the cognitive and neuroplasticity consequences of living a life as a bilingual speaker. Crucially, his work has larger implications for the field, both for linguistics, education, and cognitive science. For example, his work has shown that bilingual language processing is highly adaptable depending on the context of language use and engagement opportunities, and has evidence that the bilingual experience is inherently dynamic and diverse. And as such, in his work, Dr. Rothman has highlighted the importance of approaching the study of bilingualism and characterize it as a continuum of diverse life experiences and embrace the idea that a bilingual brain is not two monolinguals in one. Dr. Rothman is an incredibly prolific scholar. He has published and edited over 9 books, more than 100 research articles in top international refereed scientific journals, and has contributed over 50 chapters to edited books and handbooks. His research is supported by a very large national and international grants. But beyond being a prolific researcher, Dr. Rothman, or simply Jason, is also a friend and a mentor. Jason always manages to create a strong community of researchers. Many here today are on Zoom, I assume, and he shares positive vibes from his research group that are felt even across the ocean. Last October, I had the good fortune to breathe some of that fresh research air while being amazed watching the northern lights in the wonderland of Tromsø, Norway. I can't wait to be there back. Today, Dr. Rothman will take us into a journey to understand what heritage minority languages are, who are heritage speakers, how we can better contextualize heritage languages in the European and global context, but also how the study of heritage languages can shed light on how speakers can live a life while juggling two languages. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Rothman.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. I'm embarrassed now. And thank you, Eleonora. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I have to say, this is my very first live talk, I think, off of a screen in the past 2 years. So thank you all for coming, and whoever's out there, thank you for listening. Okay, let's get started. I'm humbled, and I'm gonna hire Eleonora as my press agent moving forward. So now my breath is taken away. So let's see. Okay, so first, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about diversity in the world. So there's people here, and I apologize. I'm going to try to address everybody. I know there's people on screen. I'm so happy to have people in front of me that I'm going to probably look at them a lot. So apologies if you're on Zoom, but thank you for being here. So just by kind of, you can even yell it out. If you had to say what the percentage of the world is that speaks more than one language, that's bi or multilingual, what would you say it is? 10%? Say yes or no. 10%? More? More or less? More. 20%? More. 30? 40? Okay. 50? We already have some disagreement. Under 50, more than 50, more than 50. I feel like an auctioneer up here. So more than 50, right? And of course, this audience is packed with people who know a lot about bilingualism, right? So, you know, it is more than 50%. In fact, it's probably, you know, quite a bit more than 50%, depending on how you look at it. But let's look at language diversity, because language diversity and bilingualism are not necessarily the same thing, although they largely overlap. What you see in front of you is a world map. And in that world map, basically what you want to take home is the darker the greenish or green color, the more linguistic diversity there is. So even in the context of the United States, as you can see, there's quite a bit of languages in contact, and there is a lot of linguistic diversity. Okay, so with that in mind, as a result, a lot of the world is in contact, even in potentially so-called monolingual situations. There's a lot of language diversity that's around us. Okay. At least for many of us. Let's hone in, because this is where we are, a little bit on the context of the US. And bilingualism is not a Hispanic issue. I really want to make sure that that's clear. However, the largest minority group of speakers in the context of the US is clearly Spanish speakers or ethnically Hispanic individuals, right? So this map shows you the darker the color, basically the more concentration of culturally Hispanic people, many of whom, although not everybody, will speak to various degrees Spanish and probably are very proficient in English. And so maybe in those darker environments, we could expect to have high populations of bilingualism. It's roughly 20%. And of course, this is including Puerto Rico as well. But as you can see, as the darker the color gets, you have pockets that are upwards of 80% of people who are likely or more likely to be bilingual. But again, as I said, it's not about Spanish. So when we look at the context of the US, what you can see is that there's a lot of linguistic diversity. In fact, in every state, there is at least some significant percentage of people who find themselves speaking languages other than English. And in a state like California, 43% of the population are speakers of more than just English. So there's a lot of linguistic diversity and indeed a lot of bilingualism throughout the United States. I highlighted California because that seems to be the top percentage, around 43% of the population. Well, we're here to also make some contrast in Europe, where I found myself for the past 10 years, okay, in a context that for me was a foreign context because I'm American. The numbers look very different in Europe. Okay, so I really like the pie chart that's above. This is from a paper from Viorica Marion and one of her colleagues in 2012. So I've conserved it even though it's outdated, okay? And it's outdated in the sense that it comes from the 2007 European census, where there was a reporting of roughly 56% bilingualism. But the numbers below are accurate to 2020. And if you look at the first number where it says EU 28, the percentage is really approaching 70% at this point. So that's a change already in state over the course of 10 or more years. And you probably can't see and or know all the acronyms. So SE is Sweden and DK is Denmark. And if you go towards the end of the screen, you'll see NO is Norway, where I find myself. These are EU affiliate states and not part of the EU. What you can see is that although we're dealing with 60 some odd percent, it's not equally distributed also in the context of the EU. However, even at the lower end of the poll, you want to guess which country is the lowest end of the bilingualism poll? The UK, not surprisingly. And even here, we have around what you see in the upper echelon in the context of the United States, there's a reported a little under 40% of people claim to speak more than one language. Now, of course, what we mean by speak and are bilingual is potentially different because a lot of this is going to include societal second language successful enterprises. Like in the context of Norway, it's very difficult, to my chagrin sometimes, it's very difficult to find people who don't speak English very, very well, okay? So it's not that 99% of Luxembourg is speaking the same two languages, and English might be there as kind of this booster for these numbers. But nonetheless, languages are languages, and these are bilinguals, okay? But here today I want to talk to you a little bit about the context and the context for potential support, because at some point we're going to juxtapose what we know of heritage language acquisition in the context of North America and what I presently look at by my circumstances, and that is the context of Europe. So just to show you that the conditions for bilingualism is somewhat different, what you see in front of you on at least my left is foreign language learning at primary levels. And this was from 2013, what was reported from 2013. And what you can see in this blue map of continental Europe is that the darker the color, and indeed that navy color, is above 90% of pupils. And in Norway, that is around 5 and 6 years old is when this starts, are already experiencing their first foreign language. Overwhelmingly, that is probably going to be English. But in most of these countries, you're going to see that just a couple of years later, there's going to be a second and even a third foreign language. The idea here is that the atmosphere of having more than one language is recognized universally as being important. And on the other screen, what you see in front of you is in red are countries in the EU who at the highest levels of adjudication written into either their constitutions or their laws or their educational policies are countries that make specific reference to regional and or minority language at the highest levels and include support and accompanying support for the maintenance via the education system itself. So what you can see is that you have a lot of potential support in the context for Europe. And maybe not surprisingly, as you'll see, some of the outcomes for bilingualism show different trends, at least in the aggregate. I'll show you later that it's really not different. In the aggregate, it looks that it's different. So before I move forward, we're here today to talk about heritage speakers. Raise your hand in the audience if you want online to put your kind of icon hand up if you know what a heritage speaker bilingual is. I'll start by telling you that all heritage speaker bilinguals by virtue of the label are bilingual, but not all bilinguals are heritage speakers, okay? It's a one-way relationship. So it seems here that everybody definitely knows, at least in this audience, what a heritage speaker is. Great, I've been doing this for 20 years and sometimes I'm not so sure that I do. So let's go through a little exercise that I like to play and you guys will see if we're all in agreement, okay? So if you're working at home, I'm gonna give you 10 scenarios. If you're working here, I'm gonna give you 10 scenarios. Your job is to let me read, you relax, I'll do all the work. But what I'd like you to do is put a little check, or if you have really good memory, then you figure out how many of these 10 scenarios you think unambiguously for you qualify as a type of heritage speaker. Are we ready? Okay, so everybody raise their hand. The first scenario is Max. Max is 12 years old. He lives here in Florida, maybe even Gainesville. His mother is from Germany and his dad is American by many generations, English at home anyway, speaking only. Max has pretty good oral proficiency in German and English, but it's quite dominant in English. And this is the only language in which he has been trained and or has any practice of reading and writing. Is he a heritage speaker? Maybe even a classic one. If yes, you have 1 point. If no, 0. Joao's 30. He was born in Brazil and he moved to Portugal when he was 11. If you don't know, and you should, but if just in case you don't know, Brazil is the largest Portuguese-speaking country. They don't speak Spanish, so keep that in mind. It's important for this, okay? Joao speaks both Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese extremely well. Depending on the interlocutor, It is obvious when he is using one or the other system. And Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, by most linguistic definitions, really constitute very closely related but separate languages. Surely, if this is the case with Swedish and Norwegian, we might be able to apply it here, although history gives labels as well. Yet it would be fair to say that João is dominant in European Portuguese at this point. He's lived 19 of his 30 years in Portugal. And that his Brazilian Portuguese has some, let's say, interesting innovations to it, where the grammars actually do not converge, okay? Onur's 25, he was born in Germany to immigrants from Turkey. He was enrolled in a dual language immersion bilingual program until grade 4, when his parents switched him to German only, okay? He is a prolific code switcher between the two languages. Although he feels comfortable in Turkish and German, even in a monolingualish mode when he has to, he finds some difficulty communicating in Turkish for certain topics, especially when a high register is contextually appropriate. Is he a heritage speaker? I think that was 3, is that right? Okay, you can have 3, 2, 0, 1. Lisa's 15 years old. She lives in a Latinx-dominated community of New York City. Both her parents are English-speaking monolingual Americans. Being brought up in a Hispanic neighborhood, having most of her friends as Spanish-speaking bilinguals, as well as being a member of a Spanish-speaking church, which is very important for her and her family, Lisa speaks Spanish very well, merely from being exposed to it amply in her environment all her life. Is she a heritage speaker? Her last name's Jones or Smith, though, okay? Just keep that in mind. Ping is 26 years old. He was born in Los Angeles soon after his parents came from China. He grew up speaking Mandarin only until he went to school where English was introduced and Mandarin input severely decreased. He attended a dual language immersion magnet Chinese English. Wow, that's a lot of content. School in Los Angeles. Therefore, Ping could read, write, speak, and comprehend Mandarin very well. However, he feels much more confident in English depending on the topic and indeed the audience to whom he is speaking. Is he a heritage speaker? You can have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Tiana is now 30. She was born in Italy, a child of a Croatian mother and an Italian father. Her mother has always spoken to her uniquely in Croatian all her life, although she never taught her to read and write in Croatian. After the age of 18, Tiana moved back to Croatia for university. Of course, like many stories happen, she fell in love, stayed in Croatia ever since. Her daily life activities are virtually exclusively now in Croatian. She's probably Croatian dominant. But is she a heritage speaker? Of what, by the way? Italian or Croatian? Anna's 19. She was born in Armenia, where she lived through 6. At age 8, Anna became orphaned and was adopted by a loving family in Sydney. Since moving to Australia, Anna has extremely little, 0 contact with people who speak Armenian, never really having an opportunity to use it or even hear it again, at least much. She's now belabored to even understand much of anything in Armenian, but is determined to take back that language next year at university. Is she a heritage speaker? Sven is 92 years old. He is from the Midwest of the United States, a 4th generation descendant of Swedish immigrants. Sven grew up in a tight-knit Lutheran Christian community of other Swedish descendants. In this community, historically, people tended to marry within the group, as he did. He is one of the last speakers of US Swedish in his Minnesota community. Although he has 3 children, the language was not passed on to them. Is he a heritage speaker, this 92-year-old gentleman? Zoli Swa is 32. She's from South Africa. Her ancestral language is Zulu. Her grandparents spoke the language dominantly, but were highly proficient L2 learners of English. While both her parents were Zulu English naturalistic bilinguals, heritage speakers perhaps, they did not use it much in their home. Zoliswa has always known a few cultural words, but was not raised bilingual. Starting 3 years ago, however, she began a journey to reclaim Zulu in night classes at her local university. She's now quite proficient. Is she a heritage speaker? Fatima, I think this is the last one, guys, so you can have 9 to 0. Fatima is from Syria and is 16 years old. 8 years ago, she moved to Germany, displaced by the civil war in her country. She has integrated to Germany quite well, whatever that means, but she speaks German very well. She's doing excellently in school and speaks German and Arabic well, but shows signs of German dominance. She speaks Syrian Arabic at home, but where her family was settled, there's not a very big population of Syrians, and thus many people to speak Arabic with. Is Fatima a heritage speaker? Okay, so what's your number? How many of you have 10? All of those count as some type of heritage speaker. Oh, we have a 10. How many of you, and online, you can raise your hands too. There'll be disagreement. It's part of the exercise, so to speak. How many of you have a 9? Oh, 2 9s. How many of you have 8? 2 8s. How many of you have a 7? A 7. How many of you have a 6? A 6 too. How many of you have a 5? Below 5, anybody? Okay, so we have a range from 6 to 10. And everybody in this room studies this and really cares, okay? I'll leave that as a point, right? Are we always comparing the same things? Are we talking about the same things? Do we have the same criteria? These things, of course, matter. But let's have a kind of working definition for what a heritage speaker is. And for that, I'm gonna ask for some help from some friends. Now, what is a heritage speaker? I hope everyone can hear this. A heritage bilingual is a native speaker of a language spoken at home that is not the majority language of the society in which they grow up. For example, a child growing up in the United States, Canada, or the UK, whose home language is Spanish, Polish, Punjabi, Russian, you name it, will qualify as a heritage language bilingual.
Par exemple, un enfant qui grandit en Belgique ou en France, dans une famille parlant l'arabe, le polonais, le norvégien, l'anglais, est un bilingue de langue d'héritage ou de patrimoine. Zum Beispiel ist ein Kind, was in Deutschland mit Türkisch, Polnisch, Arabisch oder Italienisch aufwächst, ein bilinguale Herkunftssprecher. Ad esempio, un bambino che cresce negli Stati Uniti, in Canada o nel Regno Unito, la cui lingua madre è l'italiano, il polacco, il punjabi o qualsiasi altra lingua, si qualificherebbe come bilingue di una lingua ereditaria. 例えば、ポルトガル語、中国語、英語を家庭内で話し、日本で育った子供は継承語バイリンガルであると言えます。
Por ejemplo, una niña o un niño que vive en Noruega, pero habla español en casa, sería considerado un hablante nativo de español como lengua herencia.
Örneğin Türkiye'de büyüyen ve ana dili Rusça, Arapça, Farsça veya Almanca gibi bir dil olan bir çocuk, miras dili konuşan 2 dilli biri olarak nitelendirilir.
Okay, so first off, I just want to thank everybody who appeared there. And there's a much larger video that has many, many, many more languages. Later, you can look at our Twitter feed and you can go look at our YouTube channel and see the full thing. This is part of one of the projects that Eleonora was mentioning that funds this research, but we have a good idea of what a heritage speaker is. So let's say what a heritage language is, at least the way that I understand it. A heritage language qualifies, or a language qualifies as a heritage language if it is a language spoken at home or otherwise readily available to young children. So in that definition, you might be inclined, if you're applying it directly, to say, well, Lisa, even though her name is Jones, might be included because the conditions under which she acquired the language, it will really depend on your questions, how you want to include or disclude somebody, but she might be included. And crucially, this language is not a dominant language of the larger national society. And of course, as we know, and I'm about to describe in greater detail, there is the possibility that quantitative and qualitative differences in heritage language input, because these are native child naturalistic learners of the language, can influence this or influence of the societal majority language, and differences in literacy, formal education. And now we know, because this was 2009, many more variables can conspire in tandem with each other or separately to result in what on the surface seems to be differences at some time we called arrested development. Okay, so what is a bird's eye view of the literature done over the past 2-3 decades now tell us about their grammatical performances and potentially the composition of their knowledge and systems of their heritage language? Okay, so these are trends. Heritage language grammatical competence and performance can differ from monolinguals in various domains of grammar. Heritage speakers often show so-called partial, I prefer the word distinct, knowledge as opposed to an utter lack of knowledge for certain properties. So for example, in terms of, say, modality in Spanish heritage speakers. It isn't necessarily the case. In fact, there really isn't good evidence to say that they have a reduced modality system whereby they don't have subjunctive mood anymore, but the way in which subjunctive mood distributes is often different, not in its core syntactic cases, but in its kind of peripheral cases, okay? Heritage language grammatical competence and performance differ from one another to various degrees. The spectrum is potentially quite large and seemingly different, much wider than other sets of native speakers. I will keep highlighting that we are dealing with native speakers. Heritage language grammars recycle existing properties. Everything you see is not just influence from the majority language, but could be recycling of properties that are internal to the language that no longer form part of the language that is spoken by other sets of native speakers. Yet, and this is important, heritage language grammars are coherent in and of themselves, and they are universally compliant, okay? These are not rogue grammars to the extent that they are different, okay? So bringing this together, this is the trajectory that the literature would have us understand it. When you look at it in aggregate, not just have us understand it, this is what it looks like, right? So now we're looking at heritage speakers. This is the majority language, and this would be for those who are simultaneous bilinguals, having access to both the society and the heritage language from the beginning. And what you see is a normal kind of acquisition growth curve, right? Over time, of course, language acquisition is not instantaneous, but you reach a point at which you have expected adult proficiency. What if they start later? They're not simultaneous. They only speak their heritage language at home for the first 2, 3, 4 years, but eventually they go to school. And what happens in the context of being first exposed, even if it's later, what you see is a sharper trajectory, but basically they catch up and catch up quite quickly in the majority language. And what I just told you in summary looks like this for the heritage language. And that is that we know from lots of studies for a very long time, especially in Europe, that bilingual child language acquisition seems to be going, and there are differences, right? But the developmental sequencing, if not potentially a little bit delayed, but the developmental sequencing seems to be the same. Something seems to be happening in the outcome, and we measure that in adulthood. So there's lots of studies in adulthood, those arrows. We know a lot less about what happens in the transition from child bilingualism that seems to be at least sequentially, developmentally on quote unquote track compared to the outcome, which we regress. There must be something that's happening around this time. And it coincides, of course, with schooling and increases and decreases of the other language. We want to know more about this middle period, and I'm going to show you some research that does just that. But let's get to the why, okay? And there's various approaches to explaining differences, right? And they're not mutually exclusive to each other. They're not intended to be mutually exclusive to each other. They can all occur for a given domain in tandem. Some can apply to some domains of grammar or performance, but all of these have been given. Incomplete acquisition, a word, if you know me, you know I don't like very much. I'd rather call it arrested development, but that would be the cessation of a continuation of development, short of a full development of a particular property, right? And good candidates for those would be things that are later acquired in even monolinguals in childhood, right? Individual level attrition between childhood and adulthood, and that would be cases where something has been acquired. We know that bilingual children have it, but when they're tested as adults, they don't seem to have it anymore. So something has changed in their state of knowledge, their individual state of knowledge. Quantitative input differences, and or cross-generational attrition. So that would be changes in the input that is provided to them that makes the context and the raw material of what they have access to different from what comparative groups would have. And therefore they're having a trajectory that can be expected on the basis of the input they actually have. Differences based on access to literacy and formal registers. Perhaps some domains of grammar are supported, if not really pushed forward by the standardization most of us have as monolinguals via education. Complete acquisition, of course, via a different path, and then that recycling that I referred to from other domains within the grammar. My issue here is that all of this seems to converge on this apple. And if the apple is language, there seems to be a view, myself included, by the way, in the middle right there, 10 or more years ago, where the view was there's a bite missing from that apple, right? There's something just not complete. The complete apple is the comparison. I'm going to problematize that now. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Also, it's very difficult sometimes to adjudicate between, say, incomplete acquisition, arrested development, attrition. Could be that something never completely acquired. If you don't have longitudinal data, it was acquired and lost, or it's just not acquired because it couldn't have been acquired on the basis of the input they actually have. When you're just looking from adult data, you can't necessarily reconstruct that. You would need longitudinal data to answer and address that. So I think of critical concern should be to refocus our research on two themes that are not mutually exclusive. And one is what's happening in the heritage language developmental stage from late childhood to early adulthood. Map not by filling in gaps between a point of departure and a landing point, but actually seeing what happens if we can. And then looking at and being preoccupied from heritage speaker to heritage speaker differences. Everything I presented to you up till now is presented in the aggregate. It's true, it's what the trend says, but we care about individuals and understanding why some look like X and why some look like Y. Then we can make real generalizations. Aggregates are great because they're shorthand, but they're not really the friend of true generalization, right? So the idea here is to look at lingualism on a spectrum, okay? This may or may not seem to you to be a radical statement, but I'm gonna say it. Strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a monolingual, a bilingual, or a multilingual. Rather, all people sit on a continuum of linguistic experience that situate individuals somewhere along a lingualism spectrum. Why should we care? And if that sounds intuitive to you, great. I promise you it doesn't sound very intuitive to everybody, even if you think it should. Existing labels oversimplify reality, and they overlap in reality too much. Drawing artificial lines, I think, jeopardizes perceived comparability across our studies. It's the exercise I did with you in the beginning. We should have all had a 10, or we should have all had a 6. And as researchers, if we all have a 10 and we all have a 6, we are definitely comparing the same thing. But the problem is you think I have a 10, you think I have a 6, and we're not necessarily speaking to each other in the same way. And I think labeling is part of the problem. It hampers our ability to generalize. Variations in conditions apply, of course, right? And it might be at the heart of many debates, right? Okay, so under such a view, same mechanisms operate over the same variables in all types of lingualism. Outcomes at the individual level are a reflection of the cumulative and dynamic language opportunities one has had. This should be true of grammatical representations, language processing. You'll note there's some asterisks there for both of those. Potential domain general cognitive effects related to language experience. But of course, domain general, and at least I think, and many people do, although not everybody, domain specific constraints apply. Timing, age could matter as to how, helping to explain why variation has limits. It has upper and lower limits. That also gives us space in which to make hypotheses to start to look at things, right? So that's very fortunate for us. Linguistic experience matters across multiple dimensions for all types of speakers. I know this is about heritage speakers, but let me make the point with monolinguals because at least that's something everybody thinks they have the same definition for, okay? We know already that education and literacy, socioeconomic status, and many other variables in monolinguals are deterministic for performance on linguistic judgment tasks and usage patterns, and not just vocabulary, but also morphosyntactic structure, right? For example, relative clauses and passives and so on and so forth. So-called monolinguals with exposure to greater linguistic diversity in their environment show proportionally greater mental flexibility for later language learning, even if they're classified as monolingual. So it seems to matter that if you're in a more diverse context, you start to accrue some of these potential knock-on effects that have been attributed to bilinguals. It matters, even if you think you are a monolingual and you would be described as such. There is either no such thing as monolingualism, maybe that's too radical, or there are many, 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 many types of monolinguals whose linguistic experience render them irreducible to a single label. And the point now, if that makes sense, is that the same is of course true, maybe even more overtly true for bilinguals. There are many subcases, but there isn't a heritage speaker. There are many types of heritage speakers, and that's what we want to start unpacking now, okay? So understanding lingualism as a spectrum problematizes, by the way, assumptions regarding baselines in language research across the board, okay? Including often often arbitrary notions of things like nativeness and discussions about that, okay? It has serious consequences for the notion of and need for traditional control groups in bilingualism, multilingualism research. I'm a big fan of having now to defend why I need it, not that it's a default conclusion that I need it. And by the way, there are contexts in which you want and should have monolingual controls or controls of some sort, and maybe often you don't need it in the context, okay? And there's many historical reasons, we can discuss it later, as to why it seems to be this default presupposition that you would need it. If your question isn't about the difference itself, then it's an artifact of tradition, okay? And it's in principle compatible with or adapted to any theory of language, language processing and neurocognitive effects of language, yes, including modular ones and nativist ones, because I think so, for sure. Okay, I think we need to exchange labels for measures of linguistic experience in the broadest sense and match them for comparisons, save for the variable and isolate the variable in focus that we think is deterministic, be it exposure and various types, quality, quantity, language, dialect, education, passive knowledge and active knowledge, age of onset and or testing, patterns of use, descriptive measures of competence, which we need a lot of work on, especially in heritage language circles, social networks and how language is used and how you have your opportunities to converge both on linguistic and neurocognitive outcomes. Language-related identity, of course, can't be ignored here. And there's a really nice paper, if you haven't seen it, in 2021, problematizing the native speaker and psycholinguistic research in general, and I'll put a plug out for a special issue of Applied Psycholinguistics with Ethan, one of the recently graduated, I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago, student in the linguistics department here is co-editing with Rachel Hayes-Harb on social justice implications in applied psycholinguistic research, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more articles like that there. Okay, so now what I want to do is bring you to the European context, okay? And in this context, I want to tell you a little bit about Turkish in the European context and some work that has been done in our lab and in our research group. There is a lot that could have been chosen, so forgive me, those of you who are watching who are in my lab, and if I haven't picked your work, apologies, but there's some really salient points that we can make on the basis of Turkish in the context of Europe, not least because of the distribution and the presence of Turkish in Europe. So what you see before you is a map of continental Europe, and the darker the color, the darkest red that you can possibly see is 1 million Turkish descended people or more, a lot of whom are speakers, not necessarily. So I'll give you, for example, in Germany, there's roughly 7 million Turks, of which about 2 million are speakers of Turkish. You heard me right. 2 million speakers of Turkish. And Spain seems to be just as dark, well, not just as dark, France and so on and so forth, right? So it's almost this natural laboratory across Europe, and there's historical reasons for it. So let's look at Turkish in the context of Germany. So this is work by Fatih Bayram and many colleagues, and I'm going to show you 2 related studies that we did. What's really important here is our point of departure, our focus group is that exact group of development. So here we're looking at 8, 9-year-olds to about 13-year-olds. We're looking at that potential transitional stage. And here we're focusing in on passives, right? So Turkish is an agglutinative language. What you see in terms of passive cannot be simply kind of a local adjustment to German being transferred over. You have to have a dedicated morpheme. So you can see on the verb in the active sentence, the n or its allomorph is not there. In the passive, it's there. It's an independent dedicated morpheme. And of course, because you have overt case marking, you have case implications for when the patient becomes the syntactic subject, okay? So we're looking at that. We have 3 research questions. I just want to focus on one for today, and that is the third one. Are there individual differences in Turkish, in the heritage language of the Turkish speakers, and how might these differences obtain from one another, okay? I have to say that this was started in 2013, which is almost approaching a decade ago. So we have not used all these variables I'm going to show you towards the end of the presentation, but it's a start, okay? And this paper was published in 2017. Here, what we're going to be doing is looking at the use of passive in an experimental condition where they're conditioned to use passives or not. And we're going to regress 3 main variables: age at the time of testing, so were they 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, Their parental background, are both their parents Turkish immigrants? Is one a Turkish immigrant or neither? In the case, they're always Turkish speakers. So when it's neither, they themselves are heritage speakers who, because of the size of the community, maintain in their homes Turkish, but they are not immigrants themselves. And then you can have a one-to-one mapping. And then literacy, which we took a pretty large brushstroke to literacy. Literacy here means no literacy at all. What does that mean? You have only oracy. You don't even go online and look at things because, of course, the alphabet is the same alphabet as German, and potentially you can make your own version of it and text your cousins. But these people claim they do absolutely nothing but hear and speak Turkish to the extent that they speak Turkish. Okay. Low level of literacy would be people who've had no formal training, but do what I just said the others don't. And that is they do go online. They do try to read themselves, although they claim nobody really taught them, at least formally, and they text their cousins and so on. The other two levels, medium literacy and high literacy, is whether the individual has had 3 years or less of Sunday school programs, which is provided by the Turkish government across Europe. In many countries, this also exists even in Norway, right? So you can bring your children to Sunday schools where they learn literacy in Turkish, and the medium group is 3 years or less, and the high group is 5 years or more of that program, okay? A formal literacy training in Turkish. Okay, so here's how the method worked. This was an elicitation task. They basically had 4 pictures, and we asked them, the same researcher, in fact, it was Fatih who did it with them, who is Turkish. He asked them, what's happening in the first picture? What's happening in the second picture, or some variation of that? And then in the third and the fourth picture, he switches to a patient-focused question, and he asks, what is happening to the little fish? Now, you're much more likely, but you don't have to, but you're much more likely to answer that with a passive, okay? And the next question is, now what's happening to him? He's being swallowed, he's being eaten, he's being swallowed, whatever the response might be. They could also say, he's swimming faster, and that would be an active sentence, okay? Okay, so now let's look at this. I have to say, I've been going on about we don't need controls, but we do have controls here. You'll see in the next study very quickly we don't. Let's just look at what Turkish monolinguals in blue and monolingual Germans do under the same experimental conditions. Not surprisingly, they do produce passives, but they don't do so all the time. They would have had 28 patient-focused questions, and out of that 28, 19 times on average, the Turkish individuals answered with a passive, and that passive means that they gave you the morpheme and the case reflected that it was a passive, okay? In German, it was roughly 7.5 times, okay? There's lots of reasons for that. It's already documented in the literature that some languages use more than others, but they do it, okay? And this is what the pattern looks like. Now let's look at the heritage speakers in German. I didn't tell you that we tested both their German and their Turkish. And in all cases, they report being dominant speakers of German, okay? So we looked at their German, and what you can see is they don't differ from the monolingual controls of German. We looked at their Turkish and compared them to the Turkish individuals. There is a highly statistical difference between their use or proportion of giving passives. That said, every single individual produced a passive at least once. Some of them just once, by the way. And when they did, they gave you a morpheme that was never given to them, which means they have the morphosyntactic structure, and the case was reflective of what it should be. Okay, so whenever it was used correctly. It was just used almost negligibly by some, but everybody used it. It's quite different. Now let's look at their Turkish to German. And as you can see, is they don't differ from their use and under the same experimental conditions, which of course was counterbalanced. We did some with Turkish first and some German and vice versa. They basically perform the task proportionally providing it the same. Okay, so now we want to go back to the variables. What might explain this? Is there individual differences? There is. And what might explain that? Okay, so we go back to these. This is what we had at the time. We now have questionnaires that have an amazing amount of information, but this is what we had at the time. We regressed it, and the variables are age at the time. So did it matter if you were 8 or 13? Did it matter the type of parents you had, or does it matter if you have literacy? The only thing that mattered was literacy, and it's beautiful the way that it mattered. And From group 1, no literacy, to group 4, which was 5 years or more, you were 16 times more likely to fall within the range of use of the monolinguals. And by the way, some of the monolinguals fell in group 2 in terms of their use, because we're comparing aggregates to aggregates. But the idea here is that you are much more likely to look like a monolingual comparison by 16 times if you had formal literacy. Maybe not so surprisingly for passives. Now you might ask, maybe there's just a boost by having more education and focus on language in general, right? If you're going to language schools in your heritage language, maybe you're just more focused on language and they're, haha, you want a passive because you're asking this impatient focused questions. If that's true, it should be equally true of their German. That is, the more Turkish education or more language they've had training, formal training, it should affect both languages. It absolutely tells you nothing about German. This is independent of it, and it only tells you about their Turkish outcome. Okay, we're not too far from finishing, but here I wanna show you, now we've dropped the monolingual group, okay? Now, Fatih, Mike Iverson, and Annika Lloyd-Smith, what they did was they looked at the Frog We're Out There story of these exact same people collected at the exact same time. These were transcribed painstakingly. You all know this is a very famous story, so you probably all have seen data like this. And what they did was they looked at 2 global measures. They're not looking now at a specific domain of grammar, but they're going to look at lexis, so they have type, token, frequency, and they're going to look at a composite morphosyntactic complexity, okay? And same variables were regressed, right? Well, it's literacy. I just told you it's literacy that explains it. Well, not for this, okay? But there are individual differences, and other variables explain these individual differences. Both type, token, frequency, and morphosyntactic complexity is now explained on the basis of not their age and not literacy, but their parental background. And you can guess the direction in which it goes. It was more lexically diverse to the extent that both your parents were recent immigrants as opposed to. And in this domain, you might have predicted that. So what do we conclude from this? Well, different variables seem to matter for distinct aspects of heritage language performance, if not knowledge, but this is not necessarily surprising, but it's important to understand that it's not one thing or the other. Even within the same learners, it comes together, and there's quite a bit of individual variation. Acknowledging this requires a shift in research mentality and approach, at least for empirical work. I think we should endeavor to understand heritage language grammars in their own right. Why do heritage speakers differ as they do from one another? And there seems to be reasons for it. Of course there would be, right? What variables correlate to each grammar's individual outcomes, domain by domain? Okay, now, and I'm really almost done here. This was kind of not old, but it was work that we've done over the past almost a decade ago. Very fortunately, we have some amazing people in our research center, so the Akfa Aurora Center, as a large label, and the Polar Lab as a smaller entity within it. These pictures, I can't mention all of them because I'd be here forever, but these are wonderful researchers, many postdocs. I'm very fortunate to have 9 postdocs currently working in this context to do all of, not just these studies. This is the team that works on heritage language. There's actually more people who work on other things, but these are the cohort of people across lots of very generous funding that's allowing us to look at heritage speakers in the context of experience to outcomes, right? And that is understanding the heritage language continuum, okay? And we think, and what this work is reflecting across many languages, I don't have time to tell you, but there's Japanese German, and there's Japanese Chinese, and there's Turkish German, and there's, I'm looking at people's faces, there's Russian English and Russian Norwegian, and so on and so forth, and many projects that are here. And what we're advocating are correlational analyses to input exposure, quality and quantity over time, so it's dynamic nature, patterns of language use, again over time, on various cognitive measures, right? So we're doing a lot of cognitive testing at the same time. More corpora are needed, and actually with Steffi Wolf here, and Maki, we're in the process of making some really cool Japanese return e-corpora, and other corpora will be forthcoming as well. We need bespoke corpora for heritage speakers to look at heritage speakers. Creation of heritage speaker continuous proficiency measures and fit for purpose questionnaires. We have spent a lot of time. We've been very fortunate at Akfa Aurora in general because we have access to lots of researchers who are related to our group in terms of Professor Tu, so Cecile Decade and Ludovica Sedatrice and her team with Sharon Unsworth, and I'm going to Philippe Prévost, and I think Laurie Tuller, and I'm probably forgetting other people who are really spending a lot of time making these wonderful questionnaires that can be used and modified for your individual needs for heritage speakers and truly be fit for purpose for them. Hybrid cross-sectional research, longitudinal approaches we're doing and we're advocating, examining the entire spectrum and understudied heritage speaker subgroups and language pairings, which of course people have brought up, right? It can't just be all English, Spanish, and it can't just be English and other languages. We need to know and see this diversity. And of course, combine methodologies with older and new. And we're doing lots of stuff that is both behavioral in a traditional sense that we've done for a long time, and really introducing neurocognition, not just in terms of executive functions, but using EEG and other online processing measures in heritage languages where this hasn't been done much before. As far as EEG is concerned, I can count on one hand the studies that exist. Eye tracking, there's many more, but not enough, okay? And with this, we think that this will bring us to the reality of the following. Remember, that's what heritage languages were projected to look like. And in their aggregate and the studies upon which this was reflected, it is true. But now we just saw a preoccupation with individuals, and this is really what heritage language looks like. Without evaluation, but still to that perceptual norm, okay? And because we're doing this in the Center of European Studies, we might conclude, and we will conclude here with this question. Well, are there differences between heritage speakers in the US and Europe? We showed you all this stuff that they were very good, and actually, depending on the variables of support, which seem to not be unique to the European context, but potentially more available, well, we see different outcomes. I think that's not the right question to ask, okay? I think what the right question is, what are the context and support differences between the typical US case and the more typical European heritage speaker cohorts and individuals that give rise to the trends that make it appear as if there are large differences, but at the individual level, everybody's an individual to be explained through the same proportionalities and opportunities. It's the cohort differences of the context that delimit why more people might look like this than others. And with that, this is really my final slide. Differences in heritage speakers and heritage language varieties really shouldn't be viewed under a deficit approach. Remember, I showed you that apple that was bitten out that you see, but for what they really are, distinct types of apples from which we have much to learn. That green apple, it's delicious, it's tart, you might not prefer it, and that's okay, but keep it to yourself, okay? But it's an apple and it's a whole one, right? And with that, thank you. I want to thank everybody. You can follow us on Twitter and yeah, thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Jason. I think we have, for those of you who have time or would like to ask questions, I think we have 15 minutes more. So I don't know if anyone online or here in the room, if some of you wants to ask a question or as a comment.
You hit the
Yeah, I need to
button.
remember to press the button. So
If
yeah,
you keep
people
it held, then
online
the
can.
people can hear.
Thank you. Is that working?
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Hi, Professor Rodman. I've been reading you for 10 years and I'm extremely happy to be here. I have a question that I'm every class of Dr. Rossi asking it, but I keep feeling it very strong in my own thoughts. And I would like to know if we are thinking that experience is also a very important variable for the outcomes. Is this making us being more far away from an innatist hypothesis? Is this making us being closer to a functionalist, experience-based hypothesis of language acquisition?
No, I don't think so necessarily. And I hope everybody heard the question, but maybe I'll just repeat the essence of it if you hadn't. And the question is acknowledging and knowing and showing over the past while that experience really matters for, I guess you would say, acquisition and language processing and even domain general neurocognitive outcomes, does this lead us more and more to the conclusion that there is no domain specificity of language in general? Is that right? Was that your question? I don't think that it leads us to that. And I'll tell you why, for the following reasons. Because noting that experience matters was never antithetical. It was never in opposition to what is and was being argued in terms of having some predisposition and biological predisposition for a language. And I mentioned this actually in the beginning, and you're right, I didn't really get too much into it, but from my perspective, there will be limits to variation, right? And those limits to variation will be actually quite useful to, let's say you're out there and you're a theorist and you don't really care about acquisition, much less heritage speakers. Thank you very much for coming if that's the case, because at least you came to hear a little bit about heritage speakers. You might still find, and I would argue you still should find, heritage bilingualism quite important for purely theoretical questions related to, the whatever endowment, linguistic endowment we might have, particularly because it's in the space of where grammars could vary and should vary based on the experience, but that they seem to not. And it's in that space, and it might be that that space is reduced as a consequence of the research that's done over the past decade and in the decades to come, to tell us that that original hypothesis space is potentially smaller than it was once purported to be. By the way, it already, by its main proponents, has been greatly reduced in terms of scope, right? That's the whole purpose of minimalism, is to reduce it into it was getting out of control, all these things that potentially were so specific, and how they would evolutionarily have evolved to such specificity. But I don't think it tells us much about, it's certainly not in any opposition, right? Language acquisition, if there's a seed, if I could say this to you, if there's a seed for something, right? If there's a seed outside and you plant it in the soil, right? If you keep it in your pocket, it's not going to grow, okay? And so the idea that there is linguistic domain specificity is that there is a blueprinted seed. And a seed is a perfect example of a genetic blueprint. But that seed has to have soil, it has to have water, it has to have air, and it has to have sun. Right? And you can map sun, air, water onto all these different experiences. The most important one is potentially, let's say it's water. Water's input, right? You need to have input, right? We know that things don't happen in a vacuum, but how input is delivered, how it's intaken. And of course, there's some work by Jeff Lids in the past couple of years, and his grad students really talk about the notion of not just intake, input, but indeed intake, right? And how that works with a genetic component. So, the idea here is that, of course, experience matters, because experience is the vehicle by which you're getting your air, your sun, your water, and oil. Now, it could be that it's just experience. I highly doubt that, but that would be a whole different lecture and a whole another course. But there's nothing about the need or the importance of experiential factors that tell you that it's impossible that there is a biological specific component to language. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Check, let's see. Okay. Okay. So if there are no more questions here, or for people that are still in Zoom, Patrick would like to ask.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. Jason, thanks so much for talking. My name is Patrick Thane. I'm a PhD candidate at Rutgers. So I was working with Liliana Sanchez. She's now at UIC. I am very, very interested in heritage language acquisition and in sort of contemporary approaches. And one of my advisors is one of your former students, David John Casper. He's really my mentor in the field. And one of the things that he has been talking about a lot in his recent research has been frequency and morphological regularity. And so I think as we sort of zoom in and increase the grain on heritage language acquisition and what we can study with it, I think that there has been, I think it's really, how do I want to say this? I think it's really intensified the challenge to the representational deficits approach, which I think is good. But I also think that it presents unique challenges to generative theory. I think a lot of times, I personally don't feel that it's necessarily incompatible, but there's this thought that in many cases, the importance of lexical frequency may suggest some sort of usage-based evidence for usage-based approaches. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on sort of these variables and how they contribute more generally towards heritage language acquisition. And this is coming from somebody who's agnostic on the debate. I'm more interested in the data than in the theory, but I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are. Thanks.
Yeah, so if I understood, you could jump in at any time to correct me, but you're asking what the observation that frequency is important and potentially deterministic might tell us about these larger debates leaning towards a more usage-based approach. Is that correct?
Precisely, or if it can be accommodated within generative theory, and I think it probably can.
Well, the first thing I would tell you is that frequency is clearly demonstrated to be important, but it's not everything, right? So if you'll allow me to sidestep outside of heritage speakers for a second and talk about second language acquisition, which of course is a case of bilingualism, frequency is important, right? Again, you don't learn language in a vacuum. So of course, to demonstrate that there is an effect of specific, exposure to lexical items and a demorphology is important, but we know that it's not a completely deterministic. So let's take, for example, probably the most frequent error in non-native English. By the way, somewhat independent of the fact that if a language has agreement, person and number agreement morphology, right? So in English, some of the biggest errors has to do with the S, the singular S, right? Now, you could also not have something that's more frequent, at least if you're exposed to native speakers, and something that is really robustly taught, although that wasn't your question, but teaching also has limits as well, right? So, and yet it's something that it seems to be very effortful for people to have, right? If you come from an article-less language, having articles, there's nothing more frequent in English than the word the and right? So frequency is important, but frequency is not everything. And of course, regularity is something that just helps you to acquire a specific system, right? So if let's say we're talking about Spanish. So David G. and Castro's work is a lot about, mood in Spanish, right? So having something that is regularized, of course, is very helpful to learning something that's specific within the language, right? So when you're looking at lexis and you're looking at morphology, and you can jump in if I'm not latching on because your face looks a little like it.
Well, just that actually David found the opposite in a recent study. He found that irregularity supports subjunctive use, for example.
Yeah, okay. So, and well, that's very interesting. So, and I didn't know that, but let's think about what that might mean. Irregularity supporting subjunctive use. It might be because irregularity is more salient in that context. In fact,
that's what I think. And I think it could support the TPM or TPM. Sorry, I'm thinking L3 in the declarative procedural as well. I mean, I don't think I don't think it necessarily argues against generative approaches, and I come from that framework, but yeah, I think it's interesting, just anyway. Yeah, I'm just absorbing what you're saying, and I think it's such an interesting question. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So in that context, let's say, and I recall having these conversations with David. So why would it be that a verb like tenga would have more saliency, well, or be more accurate in that sense, and maybe because it's just more salient, right? But going back to the original question is, showing effects of frequency are to be expected, I think, no matter what your theory is, right?
Yeah, I agree.
But the question is frequency completely and utterly deterministic? So going back to the original question is, will frequency explain everything, or will it just explain increasingly more as we understand things better and over time? And there is no question that frequency is much more prominent in all theories of language. Paying attention to the input and the quality and the quantity and the context of the input, all of these being opportunities, yes, of course it's going to be important. But the question really is it everything, right? Can it possibly be
I
everything?
agree.
And not just, not just frequency for frequency, but analogy that can be done on the basis of frequency. Will frequency be able to explain everything? And I think that at the end of the day, the answer to that will be not. Will we be in a position at some point that we're reduced, that there are no poverty or bankruptcy of stimuli? I'm not convinced of that yet. And in that sense, I push forward in terms of being a very proud formal linguist. And if the evidence really coalesces to suggest that that's not true, then we'll have to say, well, this was a great theory moving forward, right? But I don't think that these things are incompatible with generative theory at all.
No, I agree. I'm glad to
David.
hear. Thanks.
The other David. Hello, David. Okay, so I was told to tell you we have time for a brief question.
Hi, Jason. Nice to see you.
Nice to see
I
you too.
have an easier question.
Go ahead.
Not so long ago, maybe a decade ago, the term heritage language acquisition was much more current in the United States and perhaps less current in Europe. It's gained a lot more traction over the last 10 years or so. And I'm wondering if there's a common understanding of the scope of the domain. So as you know, here in the United States, the term heritage language can refer to immigrant or colonial or indigenous languages. And I'm just wondering whether in academic discourse in Europe, does heritage language research also subsume bilingualism in contexts of indigenous languages like Welsh and Sami and Euskara, or is the focus more narrowly on immigrant languages?
Okay, well, that's not a small question, actually. So the reality is different from what I should probably tell you. So I can only, let me speak by personal experience, right? So should I even say this? I'm going to say this. So the short answer is that it's unambiguously available in the context of immigrant language, right? It is not unambiguously attributed to the context of indigenous languages. And there are real historical and political reasons for that, right? I mean, and in the context of, you gave an example like Basque, I think you said Euskera, right? Basque, and say potentially Catalan already, you can see whatever. It's really politically charged, David, right? To be able to apply it there. It's not that, in my opinion, it's not that researchers don't understand that given a very neutral definition of the term, let's say the one that I provided in 2009, and it seems to be that, well, lots of people use it because it's my most cited article, right? So at least a lot of people are complaining about it or applying it. I don't really know, but it's prolifically used as a definition. It's pretty agnostic. So if you use that definition, it should unambiguously apply as it does in the context of the United States. But there's opposition to it. So we worked on a couple projects with Spanish in the context of Catalonia, rural Catalonia, where we suggested that Spanish could be viewed as a heritage language in the following context. In an environment that is completely Catalan, where people do not have exposure to much exposure, of course, in the background, yes, and TV potentially, but functionally do not have exposure to Spanish until they go to school. Yet some immigrants have moved from Andalusia and in their home, they only speak Spanish. Could you not consider that a context of Spanish? Well, maybe some of these people who didn't like that are even online, so I'll leave it as we can have a difference of opinion, but it was not so easy to publish that set of 3 articles, even though the biggest opposition was only to the label that I was applying. But let me make one point in closing, because I think this was the unfortunate reason. I think because of a lot of research that's been done in the United States, the term heritage language has become in some circles synonymous with defunct, bad, and deficient bilingualism. And as a result, what was said to us is they can't be heritage speakers because they're good. And you have no idea how that broke my heart, okay? So at the end of the day, part of the domain of use in Europe, which gets restricted, is both political to the fact that there is a better recognition of minority languages, say Sami in Norway, because some people take it as a foreign language, because that's typically what it is in the context of the US. And Sami people would rightly say it's not a foreign language here. But in addition, there is some opposition when you have a more balanced context that would meet the definition of heritage speakers when it's neutral. There can be opposition to it because, and we won't get into why I feel because it's in the written public record and you can read all about it, but when you equate heritage bilingualism with incompleteness, defunctness, and deficiency, you cannot call certain, because they're too good. What does that mean? And that's the whole idea here of this individual approach. There are balance bilinguals, there are differentially, there are differences in outcomes. We're not going to evaluate any of them, but what we're going to say is that this notion that difference from a prescribed norm is defunct, deficient, or incomplete is yesterday's news as far as I'm concerned. It was wrong to start. It's especially wrong now, but we would see that there is a lot of research that is heritage research that's not being called heritage research, not only because of historical differences of labels that were used prior to it being migrated to Europe from those of us who moved to the United States, but also because of the correlation that people wrongly make between heritage speakerness and not so good bilingualismness in terms of outcome. I hope that answered your question, David. If not, email me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone for being today here with us in person and for all of you who are on Zoom. And hopefully we'll keep in touch with other events and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Wow.